Look, little lady, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a place for real sailors, not for tourists playing dress up. Why don't you run along before you get hurt? The crowd of grizzled longshoremen and boisterous naval ratings, fueled by cheap beer and cheaper bravado, let out a collective, rumbling laugh. The bouncer, a mountain of a man named Rex, whose identity was fused with the sweat-stained polo shirt bearing the bar's logo, the anchor, had a smirk that was as much a part of the establishment as the sticky floors and the smell of stale regret. He gestured with a thumb the size of a sausage towards the door, his voice a gravelly proclamation meant for the entire room to hear. But the woman at the small, shadowed table did not react. She didn't flinch, didn't scowl, didn't even lift her gaze from the condensation trail her glass was tracing on the dark wood. Her name was Anya Sharma, and her stillness was a language nobody in that room understood. It was a deep, profound calm, forged not in tranquility, but in the crucible of chaos, a silence that had been her shield and her sword in places that didn't exist on any public map. To Rex, her silence was weakness, her petite frame an invitation for condescension. He saw a woman out of her depth, a lamb who had wandered into a den of wolves. He saw what his assumptions allowed him to see. But down at the main naval base, just 2 miles away, a grizzled old police chief named Miller, a man who had seen a share of real wolves, was just finishing his shift. He didn't know that in a few short hours, he would see her stance, the precise economy of her movement, and a ghost from his own past in the Marine Corps would whisper a warning to him. A warning that some of the most dangerous things in the world come wrapped in the quietest packages. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type competence in the comments below. This story was a testament to that belief, a lesson etched into the memory of every person who was there that night, a night that began with a foolish man's ignorant words and was destined to end in a legend whispered in the hushed, reverent tones reserved for myths. The air in the anchor was thick enough to be a physical presence, a humid cocktail of spilled whiskey, salt from the nearby docks, and the collective exhalations of men who worked with their hands and drank with their hearts. It was a place of loud stories and louder arguments, where a man's worth was measured by the volume of his voice and the weight of his punch. Anya had chosen it for its anonymity, for the very fact that she was invisible within its boisterous camouflage. She nursed a single glass of water, her posture relaxed but not slumped, a study in controlled energy. Her clothes were simple, civilian, jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, worn boots. Nothing to suggest a past written in classified ink and sealed with the blood and sweat of the world's most elite operators. Rex, however, was the self-appointed king of this small, grimy kingdom, and his rule was maintained through intimidation. He saw her quiet solitude not as a choice, but as a vulnerability, an affront to the loud, masculine energy he cultivated. His prejudice was a blunt instrument, and he wielded it with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been truly challenged. He had mistaken her disciplined stillness for fear, her observational calm for weakness, and in doing so, he had lit a fuse without any comprehension of the powder keg to which it was attached. The patrons, most of whom were good men at heart, but were currently caught in the gravitational pull of Rex's ego, saw the exchange as simple barroom theater. They saw a large man putting a small woman in her place. They didn't see the subtle shift in her shoulders, the way her eyes, which seemed to be staring into her glass, were actually taking in the entire room in a panoramic sweep, cataloging exits, potential threats, and improvised weapons. They didn't see a victim. They saw a professional conducting a passive threat assessment out of pure, ingrained habit. Her non-reaction was not submission. It was information gathering. It was the practiced discipline of a warrior who knows that the first and most critical battle is the one fought against your own ego, the one that tells you to react, to speak, to prove yourself. Anya had nothing to prove, especially not to a man like Rex. Her validation was not found in the opinions of others, but in the successful completion of missions whose details would make the blood of these sailors run cold. The injustice of the moment hung in the air, palpable and sour. But for her, it was just noise, the meaningless static of a world she had long ago learned to tune out in favor of the mission at hand. And though she didn't know it, a mission was about to find her. The transition from mundane evening to life-or-death crisis was brutally swift, a sudden, violent tear in the fabric of normalcy. The heavy front door of the Anchor didn't swing open. It was kicked in with a percussive crack of splintering wood that silenced the bar's cacophony in an instant. 3 men spilled into the room, their movements jagged and wired with a desperate, chaotic energy. They were not common thugs. They were lean, hungry, and their eyes held the dead, cold light of men who had nothing left to lose. One brandished a handgun, its black metal finish seeming to absorb the dim light of the bar, while the other 2 carried crude, heavy knives. Their leader, the one with the gun, screamed a litany of commands, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Nobody move. Wallets and phones on the floor now. Panic erupted, a wave of primal fear that sent chairs scraping and bodies scrambling for cover. The loud, confident laughter of moments before was replaced by whimpers and choked gasps. Rex, the self-proclaimed king, was the first to freeze, his bravado evaporating like mist. His size, once a tool of intimidation, now made him the largest and most obvious target. He stood paralyzed, his hands half raised in a gesture of pathetic surrender. All his loud words, all his posturing, had amounted to nothing in the face of genuine, lethal threat. But as chaos bloomed around her, Anya became an island of impossible calm. The world didn't speed up for her, it slowed down. The shouting, the screaming, the frantic movements of the hostages became a symphony of data points. Her breathing deepened, her heart rate, which should have skyrocketed, instead settled into a steady, rhythmic beat. It was the physiological response of a body and mind conditioned by years of exposure to the most extreme forms of stress imaginable. This was her element, the noise, the fear, the imminent threat of violence. This was the world in which she had been forged. She didn't see 3 armed men. She saw 3 distinct problems, each with a specific set of variables and solutions. She noted the gunman's poor trigger discipline, his finger resting inside the guard. She noted his wide stance, a sign of amateur training that left his center of gravity vulnerable. She noted the way the other 2 held their knives, a clumsy, forward grip that prioritized intimidation over technique. She registered the distance to each threat, the angles of attack, the potential for ricochet off the brick wall behind the bar. It was a complex, multivariable equation, and she solved it in the space of a single, controlled exhale. Her preparation was entirely internal, a silent cascade of calculations that took less than a second. There was no outward sign of the storm of tactical analysis occurring behind her calm, dark eyes. To the terrified patrons, she was just another frozen victim. To Rex, who chanced a terrified glance in her direction, she was still the small, insignificant woman he had dismissed. They could not comprehend that they were witnessing the prelude to a masterpiece of controlled violence, the quiet, methodical wind-up before a lightning strike. The world was about to learn, in the most brutal and undeniable way, the difference between a loud bark and a silent, lethal bite. The gunman, emboldened by the lack of resistance, grabbed a young waitress, pulling her back against his chest and pressing the cold muzzle of his pistol to her temple. The girl's terrified sob was the catalyst, the final variable that locked Anya's calculations into place. The time for observation was over. The moment for action was now. The first movement was almost imperceptible, a fluid shift of weight from her core, not her limbs. It was the kind of motion that doesn't register as a threat until it's too late. Anya rose from her chair, not like a person standing up, but like a cobra uncoiling. In one seamless action, her hand swept across the table, her fingers closing not around her water glass, but around the heavy, thick-bottomed whiskey tumbler left by the previous occupant. Her target was not the gunman. That would be a foolish, direct confrontation. Her target was the environment itself. With a flick of her wrist, a movement of pure, economic precision, she sent the tumbler spinning through the air. It didn't fly towards the gunman, but towards the shelf of liquor bottles behind the bar, 10 feet to his left. The impact was an explosive shatter of glass and alcohol, a sudden, violent sound that served its purpose perfectly. Misdirection. For a fraction of a second, the gunman's eyes, and the eyes of his two accomplices reflexively darted towards the sound. It was a sliver of time, less than the blink of an eye, but for someone trained to operate in such slivers, it was an eternity. In that stolen moment, Anya closed the distance. She didn't run. She flowed across the floor, her worn boots making no sound on the sticky linoleum. Her path was not a straight line, but a weaving, unpredictable vector that made her an impossible target. The first knife man, turning back from the distraction, saw only a blur of gray. Before he could process the threat, she was on him. Her left hand, open and stiff, struck the inside of his wrist, a targeted nerve strike that sent his knife clattering to the floor as his fingers went numb. Simultaneously, the heel of her right palm drove upward, under his chin, snapping his head back with a sickening crack of vertebrae. He was unconscious before his body began its crumpled descent to the floor. She was already moving to the second. He was larger, turning to face her with a snarl. Raising his blade in a clumsy arc, Anya didn't try to block it. She moved inside the arc of the weapon, a place of extreme danger that was, paradoxically, the safest place to be. Her body brushed against his as she drove the point of her elbow into his floating ribs. A sharp, wet gasp escaped his lips as the cartilage gave way. As he doubled over in agony, she hooked a leg behind his, using his own forward momentum to send him crashing face first into the solid oak of the bar. The confrontation with both knife men had taken less than 3 seconds. The entire bar was now a frozen tableau of shock. The gunman, his brain finally catching up to the impossible scene unfolding before him, swung his weapon back towards Anya, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The waitress, forgotten for a moment, scrambled away. "I'll kill you," he screamed, his voice raw with panic. He leveled the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Anya was still 10 feet away, with no cover between them. For anyone else, it was a fatal distance. But Anya didn't stop moving. She grabbed a wooden bar stool, not to hide behind, but to use as a tool. In a final, desperate act of violence, she hurled it end over end. The gunman flinched, instinctively raising an arm to ward off the clumsy projectile. And in that precise moment of visual obstruction, Anya lunged. She hit him low, her shoulder driving into his midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the wall. The gun discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. Before he could recover, her hands were on the weapon, her thumbs finding the exact pressure points on his wrist to force his grip open. The gun was hers. She disabled it with a series of swift, practiced clicks, ejecting the magazine and clearing the chamber in a single, fluid motion. The entire, brutal, and lethally efficient ballet was over. The 3 intruders were neutralized, scattered on the floor like broken dolls. The only sounds in a room were the ragged, terrified breathing of the hostages and the faint, tinny music still playing from a speaker in the corner. Then a profound, deafening silence descended upon the anchor. The silence that followed was a living entity, thick with awe and disbelief. It was a silence born not from the absence of noise, but from the presence of an event so far outside the realm of normal experience that the human mind required stillness to even begin to process it. Every eye in the room was fixed on the small woman in the gray t-shirt who now stood calmly amidst the wreckage. She wasn't breathing heavily. There was no triumphant posture, no look of satisfaction on her face. She simply stood there, the dismantled handgun held loosely in her left hand, her right hand already moving to check the pulse of the knife man she had struck down. It was the detached, methodical calm of a surgeon after a complex and successful operation. The patrons, who moments before had been laughing at her, now stared with a mixture of terror and reverence. They were seeing something ancient and primal, the stark, undeniable reality of competence in the face of chaos. Rex was the most profoundly affected. He was still pressed against the back wall, his face pale and slack-jawed. His entire worldview, a carefully constructed edifice of size, volume, and machismo, had been demolished in under 10 seconds. He had mocked her for being small and weak, and she had just dismantled 3 armed men with a terrifying grace that bordered on the supernatural. The irony was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He wasn't just wrong. He was a fool, and his foolishness had been exposed in the most public and dramatic way imaginable. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and he didn't see a woman. He saw a weapon. He saw a level of discipline and skill so far beyond his comprehension that it felt alien. He uttered the only words he could form, a choked, disbelieving whisper that was swallowed by the thick silence. "That's not possible." The wail of approaching sirens began to cut through the stillness, a welcome sound that signaled the return of the ordinary world. The spell was broken. People began to stir, to sob with relief, to babble incoherently. Anya paid them no mind. She had already moved to the waitress, checking on her, her voice low and calm. "Are you hurt? Look at me. Breathe." Her words were short, direct, and professional, the voice of someone accustomed to managing trauma. She was no longer a patron. She was the on-site commander, the calm center around which the chaotic aftermath was beginning to orbit. When the first police officers burst through the broken door, weapons drawn, they were met with a scene that defied easy explanation. 3 unconscious or writhing men on the floor, a bar full of shell-shocked civilians, and one small, impossibly calm woman who stood waiting for them with a dismantled pistol in her hand. The lead officer, a young patrolman high on adrenaline, immediately fixed on her as the threat, his voice sharp and commanding. "Drop it. Hands in the air now." Without a word, Anya complied, carefully placing the pieces of the gun on the floor and raising her hand slowly. She made no sudden moves, offered no explanation. She simply waited, her face a mask of placid neutrality. She knew this part of the process, too. The chaos, the action, the aftermath, and the inevitable, confused arrival of authority. It was a rhythm she knew by heart. But another authority was on his way, an older, wiser man who would see past the confusing surface and recognize the familiar, dangerous grammar of her movements. The arrival of Police Chief Frank Miller changed the entire dynamic of the scene. Miller was a man carved from granite and experience, a veteran of 2 decades on the force who had spent 4 years in the Marine Corps before that. He moved through the chaotic bar with a deliberate, unhurried pace that commanded respect. While his younger officers were still trying to sort out the tangle of hysterical witnesses, Miller's eyes were drawn to the one person who was not hysterical. He saw Anya, standing quietly in handcuffs, being questioned by a young officer who was clearly out of his depth. What Miller saw wasn't suspect. He saw posture. It was the specific, at-ease stance of a highly trained professional who is comfortable being detained because they understand and respect the process. He saw the way her eyes scanned the room, not with fear, but with a constant, low-level assessment. And then he saw her hands. Even in cuffs, they were not lax. They were held in a position of readiness, a subtle detail that screamed military training to someone who knew what to look for. He walked over, his presence immediately silencing the young officer. "I'll take it from here, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned his gaze to Anya, and it was not an accusatory look, but one of deep, professional curiosity. "I'm Chief Miller," he said. "Mind telling me what happened here?" Anya's response was characteristically brief and devoid of emotion. 3 hostiles, 1 firearm, 2 blades. I neutralized the threats to prevent loss of life. The language she used was precise, clinical. Hostiles neutralized. It was the jargon of a world far removed from civilian life, the lexicon of the special operations community. Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd heard that kind of AR, an after-action report, before, but usually in a forward operating base, not in a dingy sailor bar. He gestured to the cuffs. "Let's get those off her," he commanded. As the officer unlocked them, Miller continued, his voice softer now. "That was some piece of work. The way you moved. The way you used the environment. I haven't seen anything like that since my time in Force Recon. Who trained you?" Anya met his gaze, but remained silent. She simply handed him her driver's license from her back pocket. It was a standard state ID, bearing the name Anya Sharma, a local address, and nothing remarkable. Miller took it, but he knew it was a dead end. People like her didn't exist in public records. He turned to his sergeant. "Run her name," he ordered, "but run it through the military database. Use my credentials." "Priority access," the sergeant nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. As they waited, Miller walked over to where Rex was giving a shaky, rambling statement. Rex pointed a trembling finger at Anya. She was like a machine. I've never seen anything. I was an idiot to her, Chief. I was a complete fool. Miller just nodded, his eyes never leaving Anya. He was piecing it together, the quiet demeanor, the unassuming appearance, the explosive, surgical violence. It was a pattern, an archetype he knew well. The quiet professional, the one you never see coming. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of police radios. Then the sergeant returned, his face pale, holding a printout from his vehicle's computer. He handed it to Miller without a word, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. Miller's eyes scanned the page, his expression hardening with each line he read. The simple name, Anya Sharma, was a doorway to a life lived in the shadows, a career of such distinction and danger that it was almost unbelievable. The paper in Chief Miller's hand was not just a service record. It was a litany of impossibly heroic deeds, a curriculum vitae written in the ink of classified operations and sealed with the highest honors a nation could bestow. He read it silently at first, the words forming a picture that made the hair on his arms stand up. Then he looked up, his gaze sweeping over the gawking officers, the humbled patrons, and the utterly broken form of Rex. He knew they needed to understand. They needed to know what they had just witnessed. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was imbued with a deep, resonant authority that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He began to read from the sheet, his words falling like hammer blows into the stunned silence. Service Branch, United States Navy. Enlisted 18 years ago. He paused, letting the length of service sink in. Initial training, Naval Special Warfare Preparatory School. Graduated with honors. Basic underwater demolition / SEAL training, Bud / S Class 234. One of only 13 graduates from an initial class of 157, a murmur went through the room. The sailors from the base knew what that meant. They knew the legendary difficulty of that training, the sheer attrition rate. Rex's face went from pale to ashen. Miller continued, his voice growing stronger. Assigned to SEAL Team 3. For combat deployments. Afghanistan. Iraq. He didn't list the specific operations. They were blacked out with heavy redaction lines, but the locations were enough. Awarded the Bronze Star with Valor. Awarded the Purple Heart. He looked directly at Anya, who stood with her arms crossed, her expression unchanged, as if he were reading someone else's life story. After 8 years of distinguished service, Miller went on, his voice dropping into a more reverent tone. Petty Officer Sharma was invited to screen for Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The name meant nothing to most of the civilians, but the military personnel in the room, and especially Miller, knew it by its more common, feared, and respected designation. SEAL Team 6. The elite of the elite. The Tier 1 operators tasked with the most dangerous and critical missions in the world. Her record from that point on is almost entirely classified, Miller stated, looking at the blacked-out page. But I can read you the citations that are not. The Silver Star for gallantry in action, a second Silver Star, and he stopped, his own breath catching in his throat. He looked at Anya with a new, profound level of respect that bordered on veneration. And the Navy Cross, awarded for extraordinary heroism in direct combat with an armed enemy force, the Navy Cross. The second highest decoration that could be awarded for valor in combat. The room was utterly silent now, the air thick with the weight of that honor. Miller slowly, carefully folded the piece of paper. He walked over to Anya, stopping directly in front of her. The grizzled, veteran police chief, a man who had seen it all, stood a little straighter. He looked her in the eye, and in that moment, it was not a police chief addressing a civilian. It was one warrior acknowledging another, a senior one acknowledging a master. He raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute, the kind reserved for officers of high rank or recipients of the Medal of Honor. Anya Sharma, he said, his voice thick with emotion. On behalf of the city, and as a former Marine, thank you for your service, ma'am. The word ma'am was the final, definitive validation, a formal recognition of her earned and hidden status, and it landed with the force of a judge's gavel, silencing all doubt and ignorance forever. The story of what happened at the Anchor that night did not just spread, it detonated. It moved with the speed of gossip and the weight of legend, first through the ranks of the local police department, who heard it from a stunned and humbled Chief Miller during the next day's briefing, and then it jumped to the adjacent naval base, where the sailors who had been present told the tale in hushed, awestruck tones. It became an instant piece of institutional folklore, a cautionary tale about assumptions, and a powerful testament to the quiet professionals who walk among us. The narrative was honed with each retelling, the details sharpened into mythic points of emphasis. The impossible calm of the woman at the table, the arrogant bouncer's public humiliation, the surgical precision of her movements, and the final, thunderous reveal of her identity, punctuated by the police chief's salute. The story became a teaching moment, a living parable. Drill instructors at the base started using it to lecture new recruits about the difference between perceived strength and actual capability. Police academy trainers used it to illustrate the dangers of underestimation and the importance of looking past the surface. Rex, the antagonist of the story, underwent the most profound transformation. The public shattering of his ego did not destroy him. It remade him. The day after the incident, he stood alone in his wrecked bar, the morning light illuminating the dried blood and shattered glass. He saw not just the physical damage, but the wreckage of his own ignorance. He felt a deep, burning shame, not for being saved, but for his own blindness, for the casual cruelty he had shown to the very person who would, hours later, risk her life for him and his patrons. He didn't just apologize. An apology felt cheap, insufficient. Instead, he acted. He found Anya's address through Chief Miller and sent a single, handwritten letter, not asking for forgiveness, but offering a sincere and heartfelt thank you. Then, he changed his bar. He repaired the broken door and shattered shelves, but he left one thing as it was, the single bullet hole in the ceiling. He had a small, simple brass plaque mounted beneath it. It bore no name, no date. It just said, "Respect is earned in silence." The Anchor was no longer a place of loudmouth bravado. A new, unspoken rule seemed to settle over the establishment. The regulars still told their loud stories, but a certain humility had entered the room. It became a place where respect was the currency, and everyone who entered knew the story of the quiet woman and the lesson she had taught them all, a lesson that was now literally written on the wall. Anya, for her part, wanted none of the attention. She deflected the praise, politely declined interview requests from the local paper, and when Chief Miller offered her a formal commendation, she respectfully asked him to give it to the young waitress for her bravery instead. She had not acted for recognition. She had acted because it was her nature, her training, her duty. She was a sheepdog, and when the wolves appeared, she did what sheepdogs do. Her only desire was to return to the quiet anonymity she cherished, to the peaceful, civilian life she had fought so hard to be able to enjoy. But her actions had created a ripple, a legacy that was now growing far beyond her control, cementing her status as the unknown heroine of a story that would be told for years to come. The legend of Anya Sharma became a permanent part of the local culture, a modern myth woven into the identity of the port town. New sailors arriving at the naval base were taken to the Anchor as a kind of informal initiation, where a veteran would point to the plaque under the bullet hole and tell them the story. It was a way of imparting a critical lesson, that the most formidable warriors are often the ones you would never notice, that true strength is not about the size of one's biceps, but the depth of one's discipline. The story served as a constant reminder that the uniform doesn't make the person, and that heroes come in all shapes, sizes, and genders. It actively worked to dismantle the very kind of prejudice that Rex had once embodied. Rex himself became the legend's most fervent keeper. He was a changed man, quieter, more observant, and fiercely protective of the new culture of respect within his establishment. He would often be the one to tell the story to newcomers, not as a boast, but as a confession, a personal testimony to the power of humility. "I was the biggest, loudest fool in a room full of fools," he would say, his voice low and serious. "And she taught me that the quietest person in the room is the one you should listen to the most. I owe her my life, but more than that, I owe her my character." The impact rippled outward. The young police officer who had first put Anya in handcuffs became one of Chief Miller's best and most thoughtful detectives. Forever marked by the lesson he learned that night about looking beyond the obvious. The waitress, inspired by Anya's courage and calm, enrolled in EMT training, determined to be a person who runs toward a crisis, not away from it. These were the true artifacts of Anya's actions. Not plaques or newspaper clippings, but transformed lives, positive changes that radiated outward from a single point of impact. Anya remained a ghost. She was seen around town occasionally, a quiet figure at the grocery store or the library, and those who knew the story would simply give her a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement that she was owed a debt they could never repay. They honored her wish for anonymity by protecting it, by keeping her identity a local secret, a shared piece of knowledge that bound the community together. Her legacy was not in her name, but in her example. It was in the changed behavior of a bouncer, the new career path of a waitress, the wiser perspective of a cop. It was in the very air of a town that had learned a powerful lesson about the nature of courage. The story proved that a single act of quiet competence could be louder and more impactful than a lifetime of arrogant noise. It was a demonstration of the profound truth that what you do in the moment of crisis is the only true measure of who you are. The medals and the classified files in her record were just history. Her actions that night were a living legacy, a force that continued to shape the world around her long after the echoes of the gunshot had faded. A year later, a young woman with nervous energy and a freshly buzzed haircut stood in formation at the Naval Special Warfare Preparatory School. She was small, wiry, and surrounded by men who were, on average, a head taller and 100 pounds heavier. The instructor, a senior chief with a face like a roadmap of every desert and jungle on Earth, walked the line, his eyes seeming to pierce through each candidate, searching for the slightest hint of weakness. He stopped in front of her, his gaze lingering, his expression a familiar mask of skepticism. "You're a small package," he barked, his voice like rocks grinding together. "You think you have what it takes to get through this? To stand with giants?" The young woman's eyes didn't waver. She stared straight ahead and replied with the requisite, "Yes, Senior Chief." The instructor circled her like a shark. "This is a world of pain, a world of sacrifice. Most people break. Most people quit. Why are you any different?" The woman hesitated for only a second before answering, her voice clear and steady. "Because my hero is a woman who took down 3 armed men in a bar with a whiskey glass and a bar stool." Senior Chief, the instructor stopped circling. A flicker of something, surprise, then respect, crossed his face. He knew the story. Every operator in the community knew the story. It had traveled up the chain of command, whispered from one SEAL to another, a new addition to the pantheon of legends that fueled their culture. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping from a bark to a low, intense growl. "That's a good story," he said, "but a story won't get you through Hell Week. A story won't carry a boat on your head or keep you from freezing in the surf." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But the lesson behind that story might. The lesson is that competence is quiet. It's about what you can do, not what you say you can do. It's about precision over power. It's about the will to act when everyone else is frozen." You remember that he tapped her shoulder once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and moved on. The young woman stood taller, her resolve hardening into steel. The story wasn't just a story to her. It was a blueprint. It was proof that her size didn't matter, that the doubts of others were meaningless noise. Anya Sharma, the quiet professional she had never met, had given her the most powerful weapon an aspiring warrior could possess: the unwavering belief that true strength was measured not in physical size, but in the unyielding force of a disciplined mind and a courageous heart. This was Anya's true legacy. It wasn't in the past, enshrined in a bar or a police report. It was alive, breathing, and moving forward in the spirit of a new generation of warriors. It was in the quiet confidence of a young candidate who now knew, with absolute certainty, that she belonged there. The legacy of that night was not a static monument to a past event. It was a dynamic, propagating force for change. It became a self-sustaining principle, an idea that took root and grew in the minds of all who heard it. The story of Anya Sharma was no longer just about a single night of violence in a bar. It had evolved into a foundational myth about the core values the community wished to uphold. It taught that respect was not a birthright of size or gender, but a dividend of character and capability. It championed the profound power of humility, showing that the absence of ego was not a weakness, but the ultimate strength, for it allows for clarity of thought and purity of action in moments where arrogance would lead to fatal hesitation. The narrative became a powerful countercurrent to a culture that often celebrates the loudest voice in the room, reminding everyone that true mastery is often silent, observant, and revealed only when absolutely necessary. Years would pass, and the details of the story might soften and change with each retelling, as all legends do. The whiskey glass might become a beer bottle, the 3 intruders might become 4, but the central truth of it would remain immutable, polished to a brighter sheen with every telling. The core theme, the triumph of quiet, demonstrated competence over loud, ignorant prejudice, was too powerful and too necessary to ever fade. It was a story that people needed to hear, a reminder that the world is not always as it seems on the surface, that behind a quiet demeanor might lie a will of iron forged in crucibles we can barely imagine. Chief Miller would retire, but he would tell the story to his grandchildren. Rex would eventually sell the anchor, but the new owner would be made to swear an oath to keep the plaque and the story that went with it. And Anya Sharma would live out her days in the peace she so richly deserved, never knowing the full extent of the inspiration her one act of decisive violence had provided. She wouldn't need to. Her work was done. The ripple she had set in motion that night would continue to spread, invisibly shaping the ethos of her community, quietly building a better, more respectful world, one person at a time. The ultimate lesson was that a legacy is not a memory of what a person did, but the continuing effect of their actions on the future. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in the past. It's what continues to move forward long after you are gone. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where a person's actions define their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.